Chapter 1. Echoes in the Dust. The Apollo 17 mission in December 1972 was hailed as humanity's crowning achievement in lunar exploration. Eugene Cernan's footprints on the moon were celebrated as a symbol of human ingenuity and the limitless possibilities of science. Yet, as the world basked in the glory of the final Apollo mission, a different story unfolded in the shadows, one known only to a select few in the highest echelons of power. The official narrative was simple. NASA's focus had shifted, budgets were tight, and public interest had waned. Why spend billions on lunar missions when there were problems to solve on Earth? It was a tidy explanation, but for those who worked behind the scenes, it was an incomplete one. Dr. Elizabeth Monroe had spent most of her career as a planetary geologist. As a child, she was enamored by the stories her grandfather, Commander Neil Monroe, told about his time with NASA during the Apollo program. Neil had been an integral part of the Apollo 17 mission, though his name was never publicly recognized. He was one of the backup crew members, responsible for last-minute simulations and troubleshooting. Officially, he was never on the moon. Unofficially, Elizabeth wasn't so sure. In the years following Apollo 17, Neil Monroe had grown withdrawn. He retired early from NASA and spent the last years of his life in relative obscurity. Elizabeth was only a teenager when he disappeared in 1987, leaving behind a cryptic journal with incomplete entries. The final page haunted her. They aren't ours. They never were. This particular evening, the moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light into her study. Elizabeth sat at her desk, flipping through her grandfather's journal for the 100th time. She paused on an entry dated November 15, 1972, less than a month before Apollo 17's launch. Journal entry, November 15, 1972. The training simulations are endless. Eugene is growing anxious, though he'd never admit it. There's something different about this mission. They aren't telling us everything. The briefings feel constrained, as if key details are being withheld. I overheard Jenkins in the break room saying we're being sent to confirm the anomaly. Anomaly? We're supposed to be collecting rocks and soil. I can't shake the feeling that this is bigger than any of us. Elizabeth had tried to decipher the anomaly for years. NASA's official Apollo 17 briefing documents made no mention of anything unusual. Yet, through Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, requests, she had found vague references to increased radio interference and unusual thermal readings near the Taurus Littrow Valley, the mission's landing site. She sighed and leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to a framed photograph of her grandfather. He stood beside a Saturn V rocket, his grin wide and proud. "What did you see, Grandpa?" she whispered. "And why did it scare you so much?" Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Elizabeth froze. It was nearly midnight, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She hesitated, then cautiously approached the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw a man in a dark suit standing on her porch. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable. She opened the door a crack. "Yes?" "Dr. Monroe," the man said, his tone firm but polite. "My name is Agent Carlyle. I'm with the Department of Defense. May I come in?" Her heart skipped a beat. Department of Defense? What's this about? Carlyle's gaze didn't waver. "I'm here on a matter of national security. It's imperative that we speak." The hidden truths. Carlyle's presence unsettled Elizabeth, but her curiosity won out. She gestured for him to enter, her mind racing with questions. Carlyle stepped inside, his movements precise and deliberate, as if every action was calculated. He carried a slim briefcase and wore a government-issued badge clipped to his suit pocket. "I assume this isn't a social call," Elizabeth said, folding her arms. "No," Carlyle replied. He set the briefcase on her dining table and opened it, revealing a stack of files marked classified and a portable data tablet. "Dr. Monroe, we're aware of your independent research into the Apollo program, particularly your interest in your grandfather's involvement. You've accessed restricted documents and submitted FOIA requests that have raised some concerns." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "Concerns? I'm a scientist. I've done nothing illegal." Carlyle nodded. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything. On the contrary, your persistence is why I'm here. We believe you're uniquely positioned to assist us." "Assist you with what?" Carlyle tapped the tablet, and a grainy video began to play. It showed an astronaut on the lunar surface, his movements slow, and deliberate. At first, it seemed like any footage from the Apollo missions until the camera panned. In the distance, something gleamed. It wasn't a natural feature of the moon. It was metallic and angular, partially buried in the regolith. Elizabeth's breath caught. That's not a lunar module. What is that? Carlyle paused the video. We call it the obelisk. Her mind reeled. You're saying this was found during Apollo 17? No, Carlyle said, his voice lowering. This was from Apollo 18. Elizabeth's heart raced. Apollo 18 was canceled. It never happened. That's what the public was told, Carlyle said. The mission was classified and conducted in absolute secrecy. Your grandfather was part of it. He was one of the few who saw the obelisk up close. Elizabeth's knees felt weak, and she sank into a chair. Why has no one ever heard about this? Why wasn't it studied further? Carlyle's expression darkened. Because something happened. Something that made returning to the moon a risk the government wasn't willing to take. The last mission. Carlyle handed Elizabeth a folder containing declassified documents. She flipped through them, her pulse quickening as she absorbed the contents. They detailed Apollo 18's covert objectives: investigate unusual energy readings detected near the lunar South Pole and retrieve any anomalous material for analysis. Her grandfather's name was listed among the crew. The mission logs described a successful landing and initial exploration of the obelisk. But then the reports grew fragmented, the language cryptic. Unusual auditory phenomena. Elizabeth read aloud. Crew reported hearing voices inside their helmets. Equipment malfunctions became widespread. Mission terminated abruptly. What does this mean? Carlyle's jaw tightened. We don't know the full extent of what they experienced. The surviving crew were debriefed, and the details remain highly classified. What we do know is that after Apollo 18, every subsequent mission was quietly canceled. Officially, it was due to funding issues. Unofficially, the moon was deemed a no-go zone. Elizabeth stared at him, her mind spinning. You're saying NASA abandoned lunar exploration because of, what? An alien artifact? Carlyle didn't answer directly. Instead, he closed the briefcase and stood. Dr. Monroe, the Department of Defense is initiating a new project to investigate the obelisk. We need your expertise. Your grandfather left behind breadcrumbs, and you followed them farther than anyone else. Will you help us? Elizabeth hesitated, her instincts warning her to walk away. But the chance to uncover the truth about her grandfather and the moon was too tempting to resist. I'll do it, she said finally. But I want full access to everything you have. Carlyle nodded. You'll get it. As he left, Elizabeth felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. She returned to her study, staring at her grandfather's journal. The final words burned in her mind. They aren't ours. They never were. For the first time, she began to understand what he meant. Chapter 2. The Silent Witness. The following morning, Elizabeth found herself sitting in the back of a black SUV. The hum of the engine was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional static crackle from the driver's radio. Agent Carlyle sat beside her, stoic and silent, his face betraying nothing of the mission ahead. She wanted to ask 100 questions, but his demeanor warned her that it wasn't the time. The SUV took her out of Cambridge and onto the highway, heading south. Hours passed as the cityscape gave way to rolling countryside. It wasn't until they crossed into Virginia that Elizabeth realized their destination, Langley. Her stomach tightened. The Central Intelligence Agency had a reputation for holding the keys to secrets too dangerous for public knowledge. If they were involved, whatever she was about to learn wasn't just dangerous, was likely life-altering. As the SUV pulled into a nondescript facility surrounded by tall fences and armed guards, Elizabeth's palms began to sweat. The guards didn't ask for identification. They simply waved the vehicle through, as if Carlyle's presence alone was clearance enough. Inside, the building was all polished steel and glass. Carlyle led Elizabeth down a series of hallways, each one looking identical to the last. At one point, they passed a group of scientists in lab coats whispering fervently over a tablet displaying grainy lunar imagery. The tension in the air was palpable. Finally, they arrived at a secure conference room. The room was unremarkable save for the large flat-screen monitor on one wall and a long table surrounded by chairs. For individuals were already seated, their expressions grim. Carlyle gestured for Elizabeth to sit. Dr. Monroe, these are key members of Project Horizon. She raised an eyebrow. Project Horizon? Sounds ominous. It is, said a woman with sharp features and graying hair. She introduced herself as Dr. Marion Grant, an astrophysicist specializing in extraterrestrial phenomena. You've been briefed on Apollo 18, but there's far more to the story. Dr. Grant tapped a tablet, and the monitor came to life, displaying a high-resolution image of the moon's surface. The familiar gray expanse of craters and ridges filled the screen, but the focus quickly zoomed in on an object near the South Pole, a large, angular structure partially buried in lunar regolith. It gleamed faintly under the sunlight, its sharp edges stark against the natural contours of the terrain. This, Dr. Grant said, pointing to the screen, is the obelisk. It was first detected during Apollo 15, though the crew was under strict orders not to approach it. Apollo 18 was launched covertly to investigate its origins. Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the image. And what did they find? Dr. Grant hesitated before responding. The obelisk is not natural. Its material composition doesn't match any known mineral or metal. It emits low-frequency radio signals on a repeating loop, and those signals are still active today. Elizabeth frowned. If it's a beacon, who or what is it calling? That's the question, said a man in a military uniform seated across from her. Colonel James Reed, according to his nameplate. We've intercepted transmissions that suggest the signal is reaching somewhere beyond our solar system. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. So, you're saying it's alien? We're saying it's not ours, Colonel Reed replied. And neither are the other structures. Elizabeth's brow furrowed. Other structures? Dr. Grant tapped the tablet again, and the image shifted to show a series of smaller objects scattered around the obelisk. They were arranged in a geometric pattern, their placement too deliberate to be natural. We call them satellites, Dr. Grant explained. They appear to orbit the obelisk, though they're stationary. Initial scans suggest they're older than the obelisk itself, possibly by millions of years. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. And what happened to the Apollo 18 crew? My grandfather? The room fell silent. Carlyle broke the tension. We believe your grandfather saw something inside the obelisk, something that changed him. He was one of the few who survived the mission, but he refused to speak about what happened. His journal, as you know, is the only record of his experiences. Dr. Grant interjected. We suspect the obelisk contains technology far beyond our comprehension. When the crew entered it, their communications became erratic. They reported seeing shifting walls, hearing voices dash. Voices? Elizabeth interrupted. In what language? Not a language, Dr. Grant said. The voices bypassed auditory perception entirely. The crew described them as thoughts being implanted directly into their minds. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. And that's why we never went back. It's one reason, Colonel Reed said. The other is what happened after they returned. The aftermath of Apollo 18. Dr. Grant pulled up a video file, this one showing the interior of a NASA debriefing room. 3 astronauts sat at a table, their faces pale and drawn. Elizabeth recognized her grandfather immediately. He was younger, his dark hair neatly combed, but his eyes looked haunted. The audio crackled as an unseen interrogator asked, Commander Monroe, can you describe what you saw inside the structure? Neil Monroe stared at the table, his hands trembling. It wasn't meant for us, he said finally. It's a warning. The interrogator pressed. A warning of what? I don't know, Neil said, his voice rising in frustration. But the walls, they moved. The voices, they showed us things. Futures. Possibilities. Death. They didn't want us there. They told us to leave. The video ended abruptly. Elizabeth sat in stunned silence. Carlyle spoke. Shortly after this debriefing, your grandfather disappeared. Officially, he resigned and moved to a remote cabin. Unofficially, he was monitored closely by government agents. He wasn't the same after Apollo 18. Elizabeth clenched her fists. Why didn't anyone stop him from leaving? We didn't need to, Carlyle said. He stopped himself. Whatever he experienced made him afraid of returning to civilization. We respected his choice. A new mission. Dr. Grant leaned forward. That's why we brought you here, Dr. Monroe. The obelisk is still active. Its signal has increased in intensity over the past decade, and new data suggests something or someone is responding. We need to understand what's happening before it's too late. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. You want me to go there? Not yet, Colonel Reed said. First, we need you to analyze the data we've gathered and determine if the obelisk poses an immediate threat. And if it does? Elizabeth asked. Dr. Grant's expression was grim. Then we'll have to make a decision whether to let it continue transmitting or to destroy it. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. She looked around the room at the somber faces of the people who had likely dedicated their lives to this secret. Despite her fear, she felt a spark of determination. I'll help, she said. But if I do this, I want unrestricted access to everything, every mission log, every recording, every scrap of data. Carlyle nodded. You'll have it. As she left the facility that evening, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far larger than she could comprehend. The obelisk wasn't just a mystery, it was a message, and she was determined to uncover its meaning, no matter the cost. Chapter 3. The Signal Awakens. Elizabeth spent the next several weeks immersed in the classified files of Project Horizon, poring over images, transcripts, and audio logs. The deeper she delved, the more unsettling the data became. The obelisk wasn't just an artifact. It was an active system, a piece of machinery that seemed to operate independently of human understanding. Sitting in a secured research facility, Elizabeth studied one of the most striking images of the obelisk. Taken by Apollo 18's crew just before their communications failed, the photograph showed a surface impossibly smooth, reflecting light in a way that made it seem alive. Along its edges were markings, geometric shapes, and patterns that defied conventional linguistics. No earthly language matched them. What are you hiding? She murmured to herself, tracing the patterns with her finger on the screen. The signal intensifies. One morning, just as Elizabeth was about to begin her usual review of the data, Agent Carlyle entered her office with an urgency she hadn't seen before. His calm demeanor was replaced by tension, his movements sharp and purposeful. You need to come with me. Now, he said. Elizabeth frowned but followed him. Carlyle led her down the sterile halls of the facility, past secure doors requiring multiple levels of clearance. They entered a command center bustling with activity. Monitors displayed live feeds from telescopes, satellite imagery, and streams of coded data. Scientists and military personnel shouted updates, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. What's going on? Elizabeth asked, trying to make sense of the activity. Dr. Grant approached her, her expression grim. The obelisk signal has changed. What do you mean, changed? Dr. Grant gestured toward a large monitor. A waveform representing the obelisk's radio signal pulsed across the screen, but instead of the steady rhythm Elizabeth had seen in the files, it was now erratic, its peaks and troughs sharp and chaotic. 3 days ago, the signal began to intensify, Grant explained. At first, we thought it was random interference, but then, this happened. She tapped a keyboard, and the waveform zoomed out. Overlaid on the spikes and dips was a pattern A repeating sequence of numbers and symbols. Elizabeth's breath caught. It's a message. Grant nodded. And we're not the only ones who've noticed. Another monitor displayed real-time satellite footage of the moon's surface. At first glance, the barren gray landscape looked unchanged, but then the image zoomed in on the region surrounding the obelisk. A faint glow emanated from the structure, visible even in the harsh lunar sunlight. It started glowing 3 days ago, Grant said, and it's getting brighter. But that's not the worst part. She brought up another set of data, long-range scans from a deep space observatory. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she recognized the pattern A signal returning from beyond the solar system, echoing the obelisk's transmission. Something or someone is responding, Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. The vision. That night, as Elizabeth tried to make sense of the data, she felt a growing unease. The facility was quiet, the hum of computers the only sound as she sat alone in her office. The obelisk's signal played on a loop in her mind, its patterns seared into her memory. She closed her eyes, hoping for a moment of clarity, but instead, something strange happened. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and when she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in her office. She was standing on the surface of the moon. The landscape around her was stark and alien. the regolith crunching under her boots. Ahead, the obelisk loomed, its surface shimmering with an unnatural light. She felt drawn to it, her feet moving of their own accord. As she approached, the markings along its edges began to shift, rearranging themselves into patterns she could almost understand. Then the voices began. They were faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind, but they grew louder with each step. They weren't words but impressions, images, and emotions flooding her mind. She saw flashes of worlds far beyond Earth, civilizations rising and falling under alien skies, and structures like the obelisk standing as silent witnesses to it all. The voices coalesced into a single thought. The key is within you. Elizabeth jolted awake, her heart pounding. She was back in her office, the dim light of her desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. She touched her forehead, her skin damp with sweat. The vision had felt so real, but what did it mean? Decoding the message. The following day, Elizabeth approached Dr. Grant with her theory. "I think the obelisk signal isn't just a message," she said. "It's a key, something that needs to be unlocked." Grant raised an eyebrow. "And how do you propose we do that?" Elizabeth hesitated. "The visions I've been having, I think they're connected to the obelisk. My grandfather experienced something similar. He wrote about it in his journal." Grant's expression softened. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I need to go to the obelisk," Elizabeth said. "Whatever it's trying to communicate, it's not something we can decipher from here. I need to see it for myself." Carlyle, who had been listening quietly, crossed his arms. "That's out of the question. The last crew that approached the obelisk barely made it back alive. And we've spent decades getting nowhere because of that fear," Elizabeth shot back. "If we're going to understand what's happening, we need to take a risk." Grant and Carlyle exchanged a look. Finally, Grant nodded. "She's right. If the signal is being answered, we're running out of time." Carlyle sighed. "I'll speak to the higher-ups, but don't get your hopes up." The moon beckons. 3 days later, Elizabeth stood on the tarmac of a private airfield, watching as a sleek spacecraft was loaded with equipment. Project Horizon had fast-tracked a mission to the moon, repurposing a modern lunar lander for her journey. Carlyle approached her, his usual stoic demeanor replaced with a hint of unease. "This isn't just about the obelisk anymore," he said. "If the response signal is coming from beyond the solar system, we could be inviting something here that we're not prepared to face." Elizabeth nodded. "I understand the risks, but if we do nothing, we're just as vulnerable." As the spacecraft's engines roared to life, Elizabeth took a deep breath and stepped inside. The interior was cramped but efficient, filled with monitors, sensors, and the tools she would need to investigate the obelisk. The mission team's final words echoed in her mind as the spacecraft lifted off. "You're not just going to the moon. You're going into the unknown." As Earth shrank in the viewport and the moon loomed larger, Elizabeth felt a mix of fear and determination. Whatever secrets the obelisk held, she was determined to uncover them. But as the glowing structure came into view, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Chapter 4. The Obelisk's Truth. The lunar lander descended through the moon's thin exosphere, its thrusters kicking up plumes of regolith as it approached the designated landing site near the South Pole. Elizabeth sat strapped into her seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. The view outside the porthole was surreal, gray plains stretching endlessly, the jagged silhouettes of craters casting sharp shadows in the sunlight. And there, glinting faintly in the distance, stood the obelisk. Even with miles separating her from the alien structure, its presence was palpable. The shimmering edges, the unnatural geometry, it defied explanation. It wasn't just an artifact. It was a statement of purpose, something created with intent. "This is Horizon Base," the pilot said over the comms, his voice steady but tense. "We've landed safely. Initial systems check complete. Proceeding with deployment." Elizabeth barely heard him. Her eyes were locked on the obelisk. The approach. Once the lander's systems were secured, Elizabeth donned her suit and stepped onto the moon's surface. The first sensation was disorienting. The combination of reduced gravity and the silence of the lunar landscape made her feel as if she were in a dream. Each step was deliberate as she moved toward the rover, waiting to transport her closer to the obelisk. The team on Earth monitored her progress through a live feed, their voices a mix of encouragement and caution. You're about 500 meters from the structure. Dr. Grant's voice crackled through the helmet comm. Keep your movements slow and steady. Monitor your oxygen levels carefully. I know, Elizabeth replied, her voice calm despite the tension gnawing at her. She adjusted the rover's controls, the vehicle gliding effortlessly over the regolith. As she neared the obelisk, her suit's sensors began to pick up fluctuations. Grant, are you seeing this? Elizabeth asked, her HUD displaying erratic readings of electromagnetic interference and elevated radiation levels. We see it, Grant replied. Those spikes are off the charts. Whatever this thing is, it's definitely active. Elizabeth stopped the rover at the edge of the obelisk's shadow and dismounted. She stood frozen for a moment, taking in the sheer scale of the structure. Up close, its surface was even more baffling, smooth yet shimmering, as if it were composed of shifting liquid rather than solid material. The geometric patterns etched into its surface moved subtly, their arrangement shifting like a living language. Activating the probe, Elizabeth said. She pulled a cylindrical device from her pack and placed it on the ground. Its sensors deployed, scanning the obelisk in multiple spectrums. Signal strength is increasing, Grant said, her voice tinged with excitement. We're detecting. Wait a minute. Elizabeth, there's a secondary signal emanating from your location. Elizabeth frowned. What kind of signal? Its Grant's voice cut out momentarily, replaced by a sharp burst of static. Inside the obelisk, the static was followed by a deep, resonating hum that vibrated through Elizabeth's suit. She turned to look at the obelisk, and to her astonishment, part of its surface began to dissolve. The solid material gave way to an open passage, its interior glowing with the same faint light she had seen in her vision. Elizabeth, do you see that? Grant's voice came back, filled with urgency. I see it, Elizabeth replied. Her heart pounded as she stepped toward the opening. I'm going in. Negative. Carlyle's voice barked over the comm. We didn't authorize Dash. This isn't up for debate, Elizabeth interrupted. If this thing is responding to me, I need to know why. She stepped inside. The interior of the obelisk was both vast and intimate, its walls pulsating with light that seemed to sync with her own breathing. The air, if it could be called that, was filled with a faint, melodic hum. As she ventured deeper, the passage opened into a cavernous chamber. At its center was a pedestal, and floating above it was a crystalline orb emitting a soft, otherworldly glow. Elizabeth's suit's sensors went haywire, bombarded by readings that made no sense. Electromagnetic fields spiked and dropped in impossible patterns. She felt a strange pressure in her mind, as if something was trying to reach her. Elizabeth, do you copy? Grant's voice was faint, distorted by the interference. I'm here, Elizabeth replied. She approached the orb cautiously, her instincts warring between fear and awe. There's something here, a central object. Be careful, Carlyle warned. We don't know what it's capable of. Elizabeth reached out, her gloved hand trembling as it touched the orb. The moment she made contact, the chamber was flooded with light. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself pulled into another reality. The revelation. Elizabeth found herself standing in a void filled with stars. Around her, massive structures like the obelisk floated in the expanse, their surfaces glowing with intricate patterns. In the distance, she saw Earth, a fragile blue marble suspended in the darkness. A voice filled the void, not spoken but felt. It was the same voice from her vision, layered with countless tones and timbres, both alien and familiar. You have come seeking answers. Yes, Elizabeth said aloud, her voice small against the vastness. What is this place? What are you? We are the architects, the voice replied, creators of the structures you call obelisks. We once seeded worlds with knowledge and guidance, but your kind was not ready. Elizabeth's mind raced. Why build these structures? Why the signal? The signal was a safeguard, a warning. When your species first walked upon your moon, it activated the system. We observed, waiting to see if you had matured. But you returned too soon, drawn by curiosity rather than understanding. You mean Apollo 18? Yes. Those who entered our structure were exposed to truths they could not comprehend. The obelisk revealed glimpses of what lies beyond potential futures, vast civilizations, and the dangers that lurk in the void. They fled in fear, and rightly so. Elizabeth's breath caught. And now? Why is the signal intensifying? The signal has been answered, the architect said. Others have heard it, beings who do not share our purpose. They are coming, and your world is unprepared. The decision. Elizabeth felt a crushing weight as the implications sank in. The obelisk wasn't just a relic, it was a beacon, and its activation had drawn attention from forces far beyond Earth. What can we do? She asked. How do we stop them? The obelisk holds the knowledge your species needs to defend itself, but it comes at a cost. To unlock it fully, one must be chosen to bear the burden, a guardian who will carry its light and stand against the darkness. Elizabeth felt the orb pulsate beneath her hand, its energy seeping into her. She knew what it was asking. I'll do it, she said, her voice steady. I'll take the responsibility. The light intensified, and the void around her dissolved. The return. When Elizabeth awoke, she was back inside the obelisk. The orb was gone, its energy now residing within her. She could feel it, a hum in her mind, a connection to something vast and ancient. Elizabeth, are you there? Grant's voice crackled through the calm. I'm here, Elizabeth replied, her voice calm but resolute. I know what we're dealing with, and I know what we need to do. As she stepped out of the obelisk, the glow behind her faded, the structure returning to its dormant state. But Elizabeth knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Something was coming, something far greater than humanity had ever faced. And now, she was the only one who could stand in its way.